In the early hours of a routine trading day, a series of transactions moved through energy markets without disruption, without headlines, and without immediate explanation. The shipments were not unusual in volume. The routes were not new. What changed was the legal and financial framework surrounding them. For the first time in decades, a sanctioned state executed large-scale energy trade through channels that bypassed the dominant enforcement architecture without triggering immediate systemic response. No emergency session was called. No coordinated retaliation followed. The system absorbed it quietly, almost seamlessly. Analysts noticed fragments, a pricing anomaly here, a settlement shift there, but the pattern was not discussed openly. Why was there no escalation? Why did deterrence mechanisms remain inactive? And more importantly, who decided not to react? Because absence of response is not absence of awareness. It is a decision, a calibrated one, the kind made when the cost of enforcing a rule begins to exceed the value of maintaining it. Something has changed, not in the visible conflict, but in the rules that once governed it. And once those rules begin to bend without consequence, they rarely return to their original form. If a sanctioned state can now move strategic resources outside the established system without immediate punishment, what exactly is still being enforced? He studies patterns others dismiss as noise, tracing the quiet movements of capital, ships, and policy decisions that rarely make headlines. Professor Liang does not react to events. He reconstructs them from primary data, from shipping registries, financial settlements, and official reports that few take the time to read. If you are looking for analysis that begins where simplified narratives end, you may consider subscribing, because this work continues only as long as there is an audience willing to examine what lies beneath the surface. The significance of this moment rests not in a single transaction, but in what it reveals about the durability of the system it bypassed. For decades, global energy trade has been anchored to a financial and regulatory structure dominated by Western institutions. The US dollar remains the primary currency for oil transactions, a position reinforced by agreements dating back to the 1970s between the United States and major oil-producing states. This structure has allowed Washington to extend influence far beyond its borders, particularly through sanctions enforcement. According to the U.S. Treasury and Congressional Research Service reports, sanctions rely heavily on access to dollar clearing systems and international banking networks to exert pressure on targeted states. Iran has operated under such sanctions for years. Its economy has been constrained, its exports restricted, and its financial transactions monitored. Yet according to International Energy Agency data, Iran has continued to export oil, often through indirect channels, with estimates reaching verify, insert accurate export figure barrels per day in recent periods. What is different now is not the existence of these exports, but the scale and normalization of alternative mechanisms supporting them. Transactions increasingly involve non-Western financial intermediaries, alternative currencies, and logistical arrangements that reduce exposure to traditional enforcement systems. This shift intersects with a broader trend. China has expanded the use of yuan-denominated energy contracts through platforms such as the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. Russia, following sanctions related to the Ukraine conflict, has redirected energy exports toward Asian markets, often using non-dollar payment systems. The International Monetary Fund has noted gradual diversification in global payment structures, though the dollar remains dominant. Still, dominance is not immunity. It can erode incrementally. At the same time, the United States continues to maintain military presence across key maritime routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, through which the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates roughly 20% of global petroleum flows. This creates a paradox. The system that enforces stability is also enabling the continued flow of resources through channels increasingly operating outside its financial control. What is at stake is not a single policy or confrontation. It is the coherence of a system that has shaped global trade for half a century, and that is now showing signs of strain under pressures it was not designed to absorb. And to understand how this shift is unfolding in practice, we need to examine the mechanisms being used to make it possible. The first angle is structural bypass through financial architecture. At the surface level, Iran continues exporting oil despite sanctions, a pattern observed for years through indirect shipping and opaque intermediaries. Tanker tracking groups and energy agencies have repeatedly documented flows that do not appear in official export declarations. This alone is not new. Sanctioned states have historically adapted to constraints. The difference now lies in the method's scale and normalization. Transactions are no longer isolated evasions. They are increasingly systematized, embedded within alternative financial channels that operate alongside rather than entirely outside the dominant system. According to the International Energy Agency, global oil demand remains above 100 million barrels per day. Within that demand, even marginal discounted supply becomes strategically significant. Iran's exports, estimated at verify insert accurate figure or source here, are absorbed primarily by Asian buyers. The mechanism matters more than the volume. Payments are routed through non-dollar channels. Settlements may involve local currencies or barter arrangements linked to infrastructure or goods. Shipping employs reflagged vessels and layered ownership structures. Each element reduces exposure to traditional enforcement tools. Now consider what this reveals. Sanctions depend not only on legal authority, but on network control. The U.S. Treasury's influence rests on its ability to restrict access to dollar clearing and international banking systems such as SWIFT. When transactions shift into alternative systems, enforcement becomes more complex. It does not disappear, but it weakens at the margins, and marginal erosion, repeated over time, produces structural change. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual dilution. The United States still controls the dominant financial architecture. The dollar remains the primary reserve currency, accounting for roughly, verify IMF share figure, % of global reserves according to the International Monetary Fund. Yet dominance is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. Each transaction conducted outside this system reduces its centrality incrementally. And this is where the deeper implication begins to take shape. Iran is not acting alone in this evolution. China has actively promoted the use of yuan in energy trade. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange allows crude oil futures to be settled in yuan, providing an alternative benchmark to Brent and West Texas Intermediate. Russia, after being partially excluded from Western financial systems following the Ukraine conflict, has expanded the use of ruble and yuan-denominated transactions. Bilateral agreements between Moscow and Beijing increasingly bypass dollar settlement entirely. These developments intersect. Iran's need to sell oil aligns with China's need to secure supply and Russia's need to maintain export revenue under sanctions. The result is not a formal alliance. It is a convergence of incentives. Each actor benefits from reducing reliance on systems they do not fully control. Pause here, because this is where surface interpretation often stops. Observers see sanction evasion. They do not see system adaptation. The distinction matters. Evasion implies temporary workaround. Adaptation implies long-term restructuring. If alternative channels continue to expand, they begin to form a parallel architecture, not large enough yet to replace the existing system, but sufficient to reduce its exclusivity. This introduces a contradiction. The United States continues to enforce sanctions while simultaneously maintaining the security environment that allows global energy trade to function. The Strait of Hormuz remains under indirect protection through U.S. naval presence. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 20% of global petroleum liquids pass through this choke point. Without secure passage, supply disruptions would be immediate and severe. This security benefits all participants, including those operating within alternative financial channels. So the system enforces stability but cannot fully control participation. That is the tension. Iran's actions expose a boundary, not the limit of American power, but the limit of its enforcement efficiency within an increasingly multipolar economic system. When enforcement costs rise and compliance decreases, the system does not collapse. It adjusts quietly. And this leads directly into the second layer, where finance intersects with energy markets themselves. The second angle is price formation under fragmented systems. At the visible level, oil prices are determined by supply and demand dynamics, influenced by benchmarks such as Brent crude. Traders react to disruptions, geopolitical risk, and production decisions from major producers. This appears straightforward, yet beneath this surface lies a more complex structure where not all barrels are priced equally. Iranian oil, operating under sanctions, is typically sold at a discount to benchmark prices. Reports from industry analysts and agencies suggest discounts that can reach several dollars per barrel depending on risk conditions. These discounted barrels are not traded openly on major exchanges. They are negotiated privately, often bundled with logistical arrangements that obscure origin and ownership. Buyers willing to accept these conditions gain access to cheaper supply. China has been a central participant in this dynamic. As the world's largest crude importer, with imports exceeding 10 million barrels per day, according to the International Energy Agency, China's demand provides a stable destination for such discounted flows. This creates a dual pricing system. Official market prices coexist with parallel negotiated prices. The difference between them represents both risk and opportunity. And this is where the deeper layer emerges. Price is not only a reflection of market conditions. It is a strategic instrument. By purchasing discounted oil, China reduces input costs for its industrial sector. Lower energy costs translate into competitive advantages in manufacturing and export markets. This is not simply about saving money. It is about shaping relative economic positioning. Russia's role reinforces this dynamic. Following sanctions, Russian crude has been sold at discounts to attract buyers willing to navigate non-Western financial and insurance frameworks. India, for example, has significantly increased imports of Russian oil, refining it and re-exporting petroleum products. According to various international reports, this process effectively reintroduces Russian energy into global markets through indirect channels. The original discount becomes embedded within the value chain. Hold this point for a moment because it changes how the system is understood. Energy markets are no longer unified under a single transparent pricing mechanism. They are fragmenting into layers: official markets, sanctioned parallel markets, and hybrid flows that pass through intermediaries. Each layer has its own pricing logic. Each interacts with the others in complex ways. This fragmentation affects more than price. It influences financial flows, insurance structures, and even shipping routes. Tankers carrying sanctioned oil may rely on non-Western insurers or operate without full transparency. This increases risk. But it also creates space for actors willing to operate within that risk environment. Now consider the implication for global power balance. If certain states can consistently access energy at discounted rates, their economic resilience increases relative to those paying full market prices. Over time, this differential accumulates. It affects industrial output, trade balances, and fiscal stability. It is a slow shift, but a measurable one. At the same time, the existence of parallel markets weakens the signaling function of official prices. When a portion of global supply is transacted outside transparent systems, price movements reflect only part of reality. Policymakers and analysts working from incomplete data may misread underlying conditions. This introduces uncertainty into decision-making. The International Monetary Fund has highlighted how energy price volatility transmits into inflation and currency fluctuations. If price signals become less reliable, policy responses may lag or misalign. This creates additional instability within an already complex system. And this is where an often overlooked actor enters the picture. Countries like India and Turkey operate as intermediaries, balancing participation in Western-aligned systems with pragmatic engagement in alternative trade networks. Their position allows them to extract value from both sides. They are not merely passive participants. They shape the flow of energy and finance in ways that influence the broader system. This is not a clean division between opposing blocks. It is an overlapping network of interactions where states pursue advantage within constraints. Some align formally, others operate opportunistically. All respond to incentives. And as these incentives evolve, they begin to influence not only markets, but the structure of international relationships themselves. Which brings us to the third and most consequential dimension. The third angle is the transformation of enforcement credibility. Most discussions focus on capability, military strength, economic size, financial reach. These are visible metrics. But credibility is different. It is not measured only by what a state can do, but by what it chooses to enforce consistently. The United States retains unmatched military reach and significant financial influence. This is not in question. What is evolving is the perception of how and when that influence is applied. Sanctions are effective when they are seen as unavoidable, when access to the global system depends on compliance. If actors begin to believe that alternative pathways exist, even if less efficient, the deterrent effect weakens. Not immediately, but progressively, Iran's ability to sustain and scale alternative trade mechanisms signals to other states that complete isolation is increasingly difficult to enforce. This does not eliminate risk. Engaging outside established systems carries costs, but it introduces choice where previously there was near compulsion. And this is where the deeper strategic dilemma emerges. If the United States intensifies enforcement, it risks accelerating the development of alternative systems as targeted states seek greater autonomy. If it relaxes enforcement, it risks signaling tolerance for deviation, further weakening compliance incentives. Either path carries consequence. Consider historical precedent. The Bretton Woods system established after World War II created a framework for global financial stability anchored to the US dollar. Over decades, this system evolved, adapting to changing economic realities, yet its strength has always depended on widespread participation and trust in its rules. When participation becomes optional, the system does not disappear. It fragments. We are beginning to see early signs of that fragmentation, not in dramatic announcements, but in incremental shifts, bilateral agreements, alternative payment systems, regional financial institutions. Each step is small. Together they form a pattern. This pattern introduces uncertainty into long-term strategic planning. For the United States, maintaining credibility requires balancing enforcement with system stability. Excessive pressure risks fragmentation. Insufficient pressure risks erosion. There is no simple equilibrium. For China and Russia, the opportunity lies in expanding alternatives without triggering direct confrontation. This requires patience, incrementalism, strategic ambiguity. Too rapid a shift could provoke coordinated response. Too slow a shift limits advantage. For smaller states, the environment becomes more flexible but also more complex. Multiple systems offer options, but navigating them requires careful calibration. Pause here because this is where the analysis reaches its most sensitive point. The question is not whether the existing system will be replaced. It is whether it will remain singular. A multipolar financial and trade environment does not eliminate the old system. It coexists with it. This coexistence changes how power is exercised. If current trends continue, enforcement will become more selective, influence more negotiated, and alignment more fluid. The clear boundaries that once defined global order will blur, not disappear, but blur. And when boundaries blur, miscalculation becomes more likely. States may test limits, unsure of where they lie. Responses may vary, creating inconsistent signals. Stability becomes a function of ongoing adjustment rather than fixed rules. This is not instability in the traditional sense. It is a transition, and transitions are rarely linear. With that understanding in place, the analysis is ready to move toward its final stage, where these layers converge into a single coherent assessment. If this analysis is reaching you, and you find value in examining these structures carefully, then subscribing and sharing is what allows this work to continue. It ensures that time can be spent tracing patterns that are often overlooked and presenting them with the clarity they require for serious understanding. What most observers have not yet considered is that the legal structure of sanctions is no longer aligned with the physical structure of global trade. Sanctions were designed for a system where financial control mirrored logistical control. If you could restrict access to banks, you could restrict access to markets. If you could track transactions, you could enforce compliance. That assumption held for decades because financial and physical flows were tightly integrated. Oil moved through visible channels. Payments moved through centralized systems. Control over one reinforced control over the other. That alignment is now weakening. Shipping networks have evolved. Ownership structures have become layered, sometimes deliberately opaque. Vessels change flags. Cargoes are transferred between ships in open water. According to maritime tracking analyses published by organizations such as Lloyd's List and various energy monitoring groups, ship-to-ship transfers have increased significantly in sanctioned trade routes. This does not eliminate traceability entirely, but it complicates it. It introduces delay, uncertainty, and plausible deniability. At the same time, financial systems are no longer singular. Cross-border payment platforms developed by China, including the cross-border interbank payment system, provide alternatives to SWIFT for certain transactions. Russia has expanded its own financial messaging systems after being partially excluded from Western networks. These systems are not yet comparable in scale, but scale is not the immediate objective. Functionality is. This creates a divergence. Physical trade can now occur with reduced dependency on the financial systems originally designed to regulate it. Enforcement becomes fragmented. Jurisdiction becomes ambiguous. And ambiguity, in strategic terms, is a form of leverage. Consider the practical effect. A shipment can originate from a sanctioned producer, change documentation through intermediaries, transfer cargo at sea, and settle payment through a non-Western financial channel. Each step is individually observable under certain conditions, but linking them into a single enforceable case becomes more difficult. Time increases, certainty decreases, and enforcement, which relies on speed and clarity, becomes less effective. This does not mean sanctions have failed. It means their operational environment has changed. Now look one layer deeper. Legal frameworks are slower to adapt than operational practices. International law, compliance mechanisms, and regulatory coordination require consensus. That consensus is increasingly difficult in a world where major powers do not share identical incentives. As a result, enforcement gaps emerge not because rules disappear, but because they cannot be applied uniformly. This introduces a new strategic reality. States can operate within these gaps, calibrating their exposure based on risk tolerance and necessity. Iran has done so out of constraint. Others may do so out of choice. The distinction matters less than the outcome. The system becomes more permissive at the margins. And this is where the final implication takes shape. When legal control lags behind operational reality, authority becomes negotiated rather than imposed. Compliance becomes selective rather than universal. The system remains in place, but its edges soften. That is the shift. It is not announced. It is not codified. It is observed. And once observed, it cannot be ignored. From here, the analysis moves into its final synthesis. So what does all of this actually tell us? The evidence does not describe a single event. It describes a transition unfolding across multiple layers at the same time. Iran's ability to sustain energy exports through alternative channels demonstrates that financial enforcement is no longer absolute. China's role as the largest crude importer, confirmed by International Energy Agency data, allows it to absorb discounted supply while promoting alternative settlement systems. Russia's redirection of exports toward Asia after sanctions shows that large producers can reconfigure trade flows under pressure rather than collapse under it. These developments intersect within a global system still anchored to the US dollar, which the International Monetary Fund identifies as the dominant reserve currency, yet increasingly challenged at the margins. At the same time, the United States continues to secure maritime routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, through which the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates roughly 20% of global petroleum flows. This creates a structure where security remains centralized while financial participation becomes more distributed. The result is not replacement, but layering. A dominant system persists. Parallel systems expand alongside it. The emergence of dual pricing, fragmented payment networks, and flexible alignment models reveals that global order is no longer defined by singular control, but by overlapping systems operating simultaneously. Each actor navigates between them, extracting advantage where possible while avoiding full exposure. This is not instability in the traditional sense. It is structural adaptation under pressure. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence suggests continuity under strain rather than immediate rupture. What matters now are specific indicators that reveal whether this adaptation accelerates or stabilizes. Watch the scale of non-dollar energy settlements, particularly between major importers and sanctioned producers. Observe whether these transactions remain marginal or begin to capture a measurable share of global trade. Monitor maritime behavior in high-risk zones such as the Strait of Hormuz, where sustained disruption would force systemic response. And pay attention to policy signals from Washington regarding enforcement intensity, because shifts there will shape the balance between pressure and accommodation. None of these developments guarantees a definitive outcome. They interact, they evolve, and they carry uncertainty that cannot be removed, only assessed. What can be said with clarity is that the system you are observing is no longer static. It is adjusting in real time, quietly, incrementally, but with consequences that extend far beyond any single transaction or confrontation. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing presented here constitutes policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The perspectives expressed are based on publicly available information from credible international sources and reflect an independent analytical interpretation. The voiceover used in this video is generated using artificial intelligence technology. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources, verify data independently, and form their own conclusions regarding the issues discussed throughout this analysis. Understanding these patterns is not optional for anyone who wants to interpret global events accurately. It requires attention to systems rather than headlines, to incentives rather than statements. Share this with one person who is paying attention but has not yet seen the underlying structure. Leave a comment with your own assessment or the country you are watching most closely. The algorithm responds to engagement, and that engagement determines whether analysis of this depth continues to reach those who seek it. The next shift will not announce itself clearly when it begins. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.